You don't need me to tell you and to reiterate that we are living in a moment quite like 1962. We all know the hallmarks of the nuclear threat today. And thanks to the historical record, we know that strategic empathy, what Ralph White defined as simply understanding the thoughts and feelings of others, played a major role in diffusing the Cuban Missile Crisis between the US and Russia and averting the end of the world. But while we might accept that history might be repeating itself and questioning whether this administration is up to the task of, again, running a new or an actual Armageddon, I think it's critical that we unpack and share this story for all of its significance with younger generations of Americans who are not there to understand it viscerally and, yes, culturally. You know, as a Gen Xer, I grew up with the threat of nuclear war in the 1980s. Coming of age during the fall of the Soviet Union, it became part of the fabric of our culture to fear nuclear brinksmanship, but also to believe that a peaceful end to war was possible. Many of us took the wrong lessons from that period too, believing that good had prevailed over evil and that democracies could be created in our own image. Who could forget the images of the stalwart Rocky Balboa after training in the rustic Russian countryside, logs piled on his back, going glove to glove with the steroidal robotic Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. When Drago said, "I will break you," he really meant the United States. And Rocky said, "Go for it." So American. He had to win. And for 80s kids, there was no irony there. The fate of freedom was actually in his hands. So that's why we need to take the time machine further back, because I don't think the lessons of strategic empathy were quite learned at the end of the Cold War, and the wrong lessons may be driving our policies today. So I'm going to turn this over to Katrina to get things started. She needs no introduction, but as editorial director and publisher of The Nation magazine and vice president of the Accord, she is one of the mightiest voices for common sense and sanity in U.S. foreign policy today, and an indispensable ally for all of us in the peace and restraint community. So thank you, Katrina.
Thank you, Kelley.
And looking forward to hearing the discussion.
I'm looking forward to our panelists, and it's very good to be here. This is a urgently relevant conversation, I think. When we started planning this a few months ago, we didn't know how relevant today would be. I wanted to pick up on, diplomacy has become a dirty word in this town. And I think that's very dangerous. And I was talking to Svetlana, who is teaching students who are future diplomats. And the idea of dialogue and empathy and understanding is not about condoning, it's about understanding. And I think that's critically important in these times. You know, picking up on what Frizti said and Kelley, I do remember people making a difference. There were 1 million people in Central Park in 1982, Ambassador, and they were inspired by your later words that there was no victor in the Cold War, the first Cold War. One cannot wage nuclear war, one cannot win nuclear war, and the triumphalism, which I think has shaped so much of our relationship, is something that James Carden and I at the American Committee, please check out, often believe is so dangerous in these times. Quincy has been a great force, I think, in Washington, D.C. It's a ballast of sanity, of humane realism, and it is that to which we dedicate this evening, because we need to find restraint and dialogue. I'm reminded of someone who I hope will come up tonight, Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson is not a well-known force, I guarantee you, among Nation editors or students. No one knows. But he was, and maybe I'm wrong, we have the experts, but he was someone who advocated for diplomacy. And he once said, eggheads of the world unite, you have nothing but your yokes to lose. He was pithy, but my colleague and colleague of Tom and Svetlana's, Peter Kornblue, has a very important piece in foreign policy, soon to be amended and added to in The Nation. But we're here today with people who know so much about this event. And what's stunning is I want to ask about lessons, but what is interesting is we've lived these last decades with lessons which are not really the lessons. And what we've learned in the archives is there's much more to know. And I want to begin with Ambassador Matlock. Because Ambassador Matlock, and I'm not going to introduce everyone because everyone knows, forgive me. I mean, Ambassador Matlock, but to speak to your personal experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I remember you spoke about translating and how you were doing that.
Yes, and first of all, thank you for the invitation to come to Washington and meet with friends and discuss these things. Yes, in October of, it was what, 1962?
60 years ago.
Or I was one of the most junior officers at the American Embassy in Moscow. I had been there a year as consular officer, but I was then transferred to the internal political section, and so I was starting my career for the first time sort of as a political officer. When the what was called in the Soviet press at that time the Caribbean crisis began to develop. Of course, what the information we in the embassy were getting was essentially what was being published. The president's speeches, statements, by the various officials, and we were simply concentrating on reporting the Soviet reaction. At first, some of the communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev were exchanged about, you might say, through the embassies, and with Ambassador Brennan delivering in Washington the messages. But by the end of that week, I believe it was Thursday, and this was something, if memory is correct, was resolved by a public statement on Sunday.
That's correct.
If I remember the days of the week. But this Thursday evening, we in the political section were advised, get back to the embassy this evening, be back by 10 o'clock because we've been told that there is a message that we need to pick up for the president. And our political counselor went to the foreign ministry. He was told to come, and it must have been around 10:30 p.m. Moscow time, and to pick up the message. And he asked the duty officer in the foreign ministry, is it good news or bad? The duty officer said, I don't know, it's sealed. So it was something that had come straight from Khrushchev's office. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party. Well, at least that's what it seemed. And this was brought to the embassy, and our political counselor, Dick Davies, was one of the finest Foreign Service officers I've ever worked with. In many ways, was my own mentor in the service. But I remember he took this message. It was, I believe, 14 pages, double spaced to be sure, but 14 pages. Dick Davies read that in Russian, typed directly on a telegraph form, a summary, and had it in our code room in 25 minutes. And as he read, he would hand the pages to me and to Herb Oken, my colleague in our political internal section. And we ran to our typewriters and started typing. And of course, we would bring them back and Dick would look through them. But we got a full translation, I think, on the wire in less than 2 hours. Now, of course, any delay was noticeable, and the fact that it took so long to get a message. And by the way, we had no way of sending one in Russian because except by transliteration, because our telegrams didn't have Cyrillic, so it wouldn't have helped to send the original. It would have also had to be translated before Kennedy and others could have read it. So that's why we had to do the translation there. In any event, as I was sitting and typing out the translation, I had a strange feeling. I was not translating a text that came from the foreign ministry. It was not in, the usual bureaucratic diplomatic language. It was a very personal statement and almost emotional. I could almost visualize Khrushchev pacing and dictating because the language was more oral than formal. In any event, that was quite an experience. Now, and of course, I believe we got that in Thursday night, Friday morning. I have not rechecked the days, but the final, this was the next to the last message. The last message was one which they made public immediately, which contained the memorable words that they would remove those weapons we considered offensive from Cuba. And that was actually delivered publicly because it was broadcast just about as soon as it was released. What was our reaction? Well, of course, we in the embassy knew that a crisis was brewing, and we knew that did we think that we were going to get into a nuclear war? No. It hardly crossed our minds. We knew, number one, that we had a total nuclear supremacy, and we also knew that we had total supremacy in the Caribbean, for heaven's sakes. And so the main thing was take them out, We wouldn't have bothered at all. It wouldn't have bothered us, I should say, at that time, if Kennedy had accepted the advice, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and bombed them. Now, we were not told that there was actually a deal because, of course, what was agreed, and this was agreed in their back channel, essentially using the KGB resident in Washington as the communication on the back channel, that Kennedy would remove our intermediate range missiles from Turkey. It was a secret, at least an official secret, that we had them there. We did not announce where we actually stationed them. And part of the deal was that we would remove them, but we would do it later. Publicly, at one point later, Kennedy said, well, he had ordered the removal earlier because we didn't need them, but somebody, there's always some SOB who doesn't get to work. But at the time, we had no hand, and we were just all gung-ho. Yeah. And, let's get rid of the things. How could he do that sort of thing? And, oh, yes, we won. We were, as one body, I think it was the Secretary of State at the time, said we were eyeball to eyeball, and they were the first to blink.
He also said, I believe, that
What have we
were
learned
lucky.
since then?
We were lucky.
Yeah.
To,
what have we learned since then? Because I was privileged to sit in and participate several years later in conferences between the Soviets involved and many of the Americans. These were sort of organized by George Kim, and George came to one of them to Moscow. And what we learned, number one, if we had bombed those. The colonels in charge of the missiles had authority to launch them if they were under attack. We could have attacked and lost Miami. What we learned also later, one of their submarines that our destroyers had under cover and were prevented from surfacing. They were old style and had to surface presently. They had nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And on one of them, the commander of that submarine, when he was cornered by the destroyer, actually gave orders to release the torpedo at the destroyer. Fortunately, the commander of the squadron was on the same submarine and countermanded the order. You know, what strikes me later was how, we were, and I must say that when the crisis was over and we began to get letters, this is before email and things, we would begin to get letters from relatives and friends saying, oh, we went through such a crisis, we were afraid for you. We say, what are you talking about? We weren't close to war. I mean, we had them by the balls and we squeezed. I mean, this was our attitude in Moscow. So I would say that what we've learned since then, I don't know whether you want to go on and think about it. I think we'll do some other things, and then we can talk about
more
whether
about the
there's any
lesson.
relevance today.
Thank you. Svetlana, you returned from Geneva, you and Tom, and I think you were discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis with a new generation of security arms experts. You said the lessons are very different, or the perspective on what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis is very different in Russia and has been over the years, and what that means moving forward.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be in this room with many, many, many faces I love and respect, and with Ambassador Matlock, first of all, and also interestingly at the same table with editors of two publications that I read all the time. It's just,
Thank you.
Some of the best voices are here in Washington today. So I would like to talk a little bit about the difference in the lessons that were drawn. We will start with the real difference in lived experience. Here in the United States, many people remember the nuclear drills and hiding under the desk, and members of the Kennedy administration, many of them are on the record saying that they thought, in the words of McNamara, that the 27th might be the last day of their life. They might have seen the last sunset that day. So there was a real danger and knowledge that the crisis might lead to not just any war, but the end of civilization. In Moscow, with the exception of very, very small circle of the presidium and the top military leadership, the public did not know anything about what was going on. The official story was that the United States were planning to invade Cuba. And to defend Cuba from the American invasion, the Soviets provided some military assistance and put pressure on the Americans. And so the Americans then agreed to not invade Cuba and gave the pledge not to invade Cuba. And so some of these forces were withdrawn. So the word nuclear never entered public discourse. And the leadership on the most dangerous day of the crisis went to the Bolshoi to watch ballet to show everybody that, nothing special is happening. In fact, Ambassador Matlock told us wonderful stories from his experience. I don't have experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I was at Moscow State University in the mid-'80s. And in 1987, our very, very talented and very progressive lecturer on U.S. foreign policy, Valery Gorokhov, who was my advisor, he said at this particular seminar in the fall of 1987, he said, and now I will tell you a secret that you as international relations specialists should know, because now we have glassness and openness and, you know, secrets finally have to come out. He said, we deployed nuclear weapons to Cuba in 1962. Yeah, this is the fall of 1987. And we all gasped. I mean, we were like, oh, really, you know, because it was not known. So the Soviet people at the time, and you can check my words by trying to read the Soviet newspapers at the time, there would be little information, like paragraphs saying there's tension around Cuba, the American aggressors are developing their designs, not a word about any missiles, any nuclear weapons. And even I asked, you know, my father was in the military, and we asked diplomats who were at that time studying at Moscow State University of International Relations, MGIMO. Nobody had any idea.
Wow.
So the Soviet population never lived through the experience of a possibility that the world might end. And I think later in the 1990s, of course, there was a lot of research on the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it turned out, and all the revelations about the actual weapons that the Soviets put into Cuba. But talking to young international relations experts just a week ago made me feel like the lesson that they learned from the way the Cuban Missile Crisis is taught now in Russia is the lesson of toughness, the lesson of not compromising and pushing through and waiting till the other blinks. And then in some strange irony is that the lesson that the Russian young experts are learning now is the wrong lesson that the Kennedy administration wanted to project, that we were tough, we did not compromise, we went eyeball to eyeball and pushed until they blinked. And that is the take that at least this group of people had. They believed that what is necessary now is to make the American public feel real fear and not to stop in the defense of national interests. But that leads me to a different observation. I am now teaching master's students at American University at School of International Service. And it struck me that there's very little ability to empathize with the other side. There are certain assumptions about what the Russians want, what the Russians are doing, what motivates them, but there is very little actual study of Russia, Russian politics, Russian culture, Russian history. Very, very little background on things Russian, even in those students who came specifically to look at U.S.-Russian relations. And they're very well prepared otherwise. They're very, very well educated, intelligent, eloquent people, but there's no basis there, no preparation for communication, for dealing with the next generation of Russian diplomats. So what I'm saying, and of course my angle is very small and very particular at this moment, but I don't see enough empathy. And I think looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis teaches you that empathy and diplomacy are the most important things. And these are the things that helped us, plus luck, to get out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I would encourage and ask for more efforts to understand the other. You don't have to like them, you don't have to sympathize with them, but to understand how they think, why they see things this way, right? We just talked in the beginning of this session about perceptions and misperceptions. I think they're piling up. The Russians and the Americans completely misperceive each other's motivation, like what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the American side misperceived, could not understand why Khrushchev put those missiles in Cuba, and that was part of the shock. So I think the next step is to try to talk to each other and try to ask genuinely, tell me how you see this. Even if I disagree completely, I just want to hear what you're saying. And if that came from both sides, maybe we could learn some right lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you, Svetlana. That's beautiful. I want to turn to Tom, but Svetlana, diplomacy in this country seems to have become associated with appeasement, or it needs to be redefined in the way you talked about it. It's very powerful. Tom, so you and Svetlana have been on the road, and Cuban Missile Crisis at 60. I did not realize that today is different than another day. Today is the most dangerous. The 27th was the most dangerous day in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Would you tell us why you posted 20 things today, maybe a few as to why it is a day unlike any other to sound?
Scariest day.
Yeah, the scariest.
I'd be remiss if I didn't just start by thanking Frizti, who actually is responsible not only for the first batch of boxes of declassified documents donated to the National Security Archive. She actually donated the IRS tax exemption from that project, the military audit project, that the National Security Archive, with some name changes, has worked under ever since. And so Frizti is a founder. What Katrina is mentioning is that today the National Security Archive published the Joint Chiefs of Staff minutes of their 6.5-hour meeting on this day 60 years ago. 6.5 hours of a cascade of crises. Starts with, oh my gosh, the Cuban anti-aircraft gunners are shooting at our low-level planes. Goes on. 10 o'clock. One of our U-2s is missing over Siberia. It was a routine air sampling mission picking up residue of Soviet nuclear tests, and it's missing. Oh my gosh, this could set off a nuclear war. McNamara hears about it, tells the Joint Chiefs, I've got to rush out and let the Secretary of State know. This could mean war, right? And it's a guy, Chuck Maltzby was the U-2 pilot, and he got blinded by the Aurora Borealis and got off course, supposed to go to the pole and back to Alaska. He's over Chukotka Peninsula somewhere, and MiGs start scrambling from 2 Soviet air bases to come knock him out of the sky, right? So when MiGs start scrambling from their air bases, our F-102s start scrambling from Alaska, except it's DEFCON 2 because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So under the wings of our F-102 Delta Daggers are no longer any conventional rocket to shoot a MiG. It's nuclear air-to-air missiles. They're meant to take out whole bomber fleets. So we got F-102 scrambling to take out the MiGs. Okay, that's the first time that JFK said there's always some SOB who doesn't get the word, right? Then get around 1 o'clock. Whoa, another U-2 plane is missing over Cuba. What happened? Within about 30 minutes, they've been shot down. We've got a signals intercept. They've recovered. This is Rudolph Anderson. Wow, what happened? In Washington, they saw it. This is an incredible escalation. In Moscow, we've got the notes from the Presidium. Khrushchev saw it as, oh my God, things are out of control. I gave specific orders not to shoot down the U-2s. What does this mean for the nukes that I've told them not to shoot? It means I don't have any control. over those local commanders. This is all happening. This was 1 o'clock today, 60 years ago, right? And it keeps going. So then at about 4 o'clock, the Joint Chiefs say to each other, well, I don't know, the White House, they're getting a little scared. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs says, the president wants to trade our missiles in Turkey for their missiles in Cuba, but I think he's the only one who's in favor of that. Everybody else is ready to invade. The chief says, yes, let's go ahead. Despite that shoot down, we should be ready to start our airstrikes on Monday, invade by Friday. That's at 4 o'clock, they give that recommendation to the president of the United States. I would love to have seen his face. By that time, John F. Kennedy knew there were only some diplomatic ways out. By 5 o'clock, 15 miles away from Guantanamo, the Soviets had moved a little group of their cruise missiles, short-range cruise missiles called FKRs, front-range cruise missiles. And unbeknownst to the United States, they had 80 nuclear warheads, tactical battlefield nuclear warheads. So if we'd started bombing on Monday, Guantanamo would have joined Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a smoking, radiating ruin. That's how close we were, right? That's 5 o'clock. Okay, let's keep going. 6 o'clock, at about 6:30 is when Jack mentioned the submarines. Svetlana is the world's expert on what happened on that Soviet submarine, has just published the only reminiscences by the one eyewitness to the conning tower incident, how close they came to launching the nuclear torpedo. So I'm going to just quickly try to summarize it. Right at this time, about 7:30, 60 years ago today, a United States destroyer named the Beale was dropping these signaling depth charges. Like signaling depth charges, these tiny little kind of hand grenade-like things that pop. They drop and they pop, they make a little sound, and the sub is supposed to hear it, and supposedly it's supposed to force the sub to the surface. Not going to happen. The worst thing happened to sub captain. The only reason they really came to the surface is to replenish their batteries. But at about 6:59, the destroyers are dropping these signaling depth charges, and only 40 years later did we get the lieutenant who signed the deck log for the Beale to describe how his sailors were so frustrated that these little firecrackers that they were dropping over, that's not going to get any sub's attention. We've got to do something. So they took the hand grenades and put them in empty toilet paper tubes, cardboard tubes, right? You pull the pin, put it in the tube, drop it overboard, takes 200, 300 meters for the salt water to eat through the cardboard. Pin pops up, thing explodes, except now it's right next to the hull of the submarine. In 2002, Svetlana brought to Havana at our big conference somebody who was on that submarine, B-59, the signals officer, Vadim Orlov, who said, being inside that sub, we were meant for the Arctic. It was 180 degrees. It was miserable. We were all coming down with the rashes. And then it felt like we were in an oil drum being hit with a sledgehammer, right? In these conditions, the captain could have shot a nuclear torpedo. The point is simply that things were completely out of control. Khrushchev saw it when the U-2 got shot down. Kennedy, I think, had seen it earlier. He saw it on October 21st when the head of the Tactical Air Command briefed President Kennedy. We have McNamara's notes. And Kennedy says, so you're going to run 500 sorties, drop more bombs than in like 3 months of World War II, so you're going to be able to get all the missiles, right? General Walter Sweeney, an honest man, says, Mr. President, we're going to run a very successful set of sorties. We're going to bomb the hell out of them. But I can't guarantee that we're going to get all the missiles. We may not even have identified all of them. He says this. And in fact, we now know retrospectively, United States intelligence only identified 33 out of the 42 medium-range missiles. In the immortal words of Randy Newman's great song, Political Science, boom goes London and boom Paris, more room for you, more boom goes Atlanta, boom Miami. That's what went through John Kennedy's head, and that's why he went. So I just give you a little sense, these are the dangers, and yet despite all of this recklessness, so huge recklessness by Kennedy with mongoose and assassination and trying to overthrow Cuba. Recklessness by Khrushchev by thinking he could move the missiles there secretly. In fact, he just put him in a position of a liar. And yet at the moment of the crisis, both of them on Saturday, October 27th, 60 years ago, said, events are in the saddle and riding mankind. It's time to back off, folks. And Kennedy sent his brother to go meet Dobrynin at the Justice Department and offer that trade, that deal, which is what ultimately resolved the crisis. But the point here is, I think the lessons are, just from that little resume of danger, nukes are fundamentally destabilizing, dark alleys down which none of us should ever go. Escalation always bites you in the butt, right? It doesn't really work. And diplomacy and communication of the kind that Jack and Svetlana are talking about is just essential. It may not be able to change facts on the grounds, but it's got to be going the whole time. And that brings me to these narratives that Svetlana was mentioning that we've heard. She, bless her heart, we're the personification of U.S.-Russian accord. She got me in front of the audience at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry about a month ago to talk about lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the scariest set of comments and lessons that I have heard in all my years of studying the missile crisis, we heard listening to what they had to say. And what they, at least 4 of the 21 speakers, called outright on the record for demonstration use of tactical nuclear weapons. And a couple of the experts whom I have known for decades and respect said basically, the problem today is the Americans won't compromise because they no longer feel that nuclear fear that they felt in 1962. So we got to raise the sense of fear. And I say back, folks, wrong lessons.
Wrong lessons.
You know, it wasn't eyeball to eyeball and they blinked. It was, we both blinked. These aren't annals of brinksmanship. It's annals of blinksmanship. It's who could blink quicker, right?
Yeah.
It's like that was the core lesson. It was done with diplomacy. But the spin that the Kennedys and everyone around put on it, he was tough, he was resolute. Adlai Stevenson wanted a Munich, right? Published in the Saturday Evening Post a few weeks later. The people who were in the room when John F. Kennedy sent his brother to meet with Dobrynin did not include the Vice President of the United States, a guy named Lyndon Johnson, who thought, oh, we go eyeball and eyeball with those communists, like the ones in Hanoi, and they'll blink. And he went right into the escalation. He had some people around him, like Bundy and McNamara, should have known better and didn't stop it.
And George Ball.
And George Ball, who certainly
later
knew.
played.
So long point is, and we'll get in the next segment here to some lessons for the future, is I think the whole nuclear subject does offer some real opportunities for empathy and dialogue and common ground.
Yes.
I don't think Ukraine offers that. So my one recommendation would be change the subject, but get into those serious discussions. Welcome.
Thank you.
More thoughts.
Thank you. But I thank you, Tom. Escalation will bite you in the butt, and other lessons, the importance of diplomacy. But no two crises situations are the same. But Ambassador Matlock, what are the lessons you draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis for today, for the situation we're in today? There is the nuke issue, which could be, I think, as you said, more inclusive, Tom. I mean, and I wanted to add, I spoke to someone who's been part of the Quincy ACURA network. We've done panels with former Governor Jerry Brown, who is part of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And he was on a call just the other day with Nunn and Mullen, but more important, Alexei Arbatov, who was probably 60s, but a different generation who was very concerned. This was the other day before, I believe, Putin said at the Valdai conference today, they're not going to use nukes, but that he was worried, Arbatov, that there were 2 weeks or so. You know, there was just short time. But a different generation in an interesting way, because you're talking about Russian arms controllers of today. But Ambassador Matlock, forgive me, the lessons for today.
Well, certainly the two situations have many differences. And I cannot imagine, by the way, that President Putin would find it useful to use a nuclear weapon. And But on the other hand, whenever you have a situation where countries with them are confronting each other over an issue that one considers vital to its security, whether it's right or not, you're in a dangerous situation. And I think that one of the problems we have, and this may sound naive or something, but this process of totally vilifying Vladimir Putin, even in public, by a succession of our presidents, and particularly beginning with our present president, who actually was running for president on a platform, if I recall, in 2008, where he said he was going to stand up to Vladimir Putin. What had Putin done to us? He had tried to cooperate in almost every way. And when he laid out in Munich in 2007 his problems, if you look carefully at that and are clear-minded about it, there was not a thing that worried him that we had to do in our own security. So we're in a situation now that, and so what, okay, here is one place where there is a similarity. When Khrushchev placed nuclear weapons on Cuba, which, by the way, at the time he had a legal right to do. We had tried to invade Cuba. That was against international law. Cuba had a right under international law to make an alliance with anybody it wanted to. But, of course, Kennedy was right to say this is absolutely unacceptable because we've used it as, as a major threat to our own security. Now, we can argue and discuss endlessly the fact that Putin's attitude toward Ukraine is criminal and all of that. But there is no question that in his mind and in the minds of many Russians, Ukraine is not only vital to their security, but vital to their national identity. You don't get any more dangerous fiddling around with that with another country, particularly if it does have nuclear weapons, because you're getting into, I would say, the irrational side. There's no rational way to use these weapons. And I know I was one who supported George Shultz and several others in the 1990s in arguing strongly that we needed a process to get rid of them. They are not useful militarily. But the very existence, if they are used, there is no known way we can make sure it doesn't get escalated. And mistakes can be made. As we've seen, it just happened that in the case of a few individuals making decisions at that time, we didn't get into an exchange of nuclear weapons in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, I cannot believe that Vladimir Putin would actually use nukes. I don't see that. On the other hand, as somebody has mentioned, there are other things you can do which would further inflame tensions. Suppose he takes out some of our commercial satellites, not military. Now, we have, in effect, declared war against him economically, doing everything we can to weaken the country. That is not a rational policy. Because looking ahead, what is really facing those of you who are a generation younger than I am? How are we going to deal with the global warming. We're seeing the fires, the floods, God knows what all going on now, and very soon there's going to be a tipping thing. We're all now engulfed with refugees from various places, many more now than the richer countries can absorb. And then we've still got COVID, and who knows who's coming next. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we're fighting over where borders are drawn. The very thing that brought us 2 world wars in the 20th century. It makes no sense.
It makes no sense.
Now, so the thing is that I would say, now we have gotten ourselves on both sides in a no-win position. I think that the whole Ukraine matter could have been regulated and calmed earlier if Ukraine had been willing to implement the Minsk agreement. And we should have encouraged them to do so by denying any aid until they did so. After all, they agreed with this, and we had. But instead, we give them aid regardless, and then we began in the Trump administration to give them direct military aid. So in Putin's eyes, they were already de facto members of NATO, and what we've done since then is certainly convincing them of that. And it has been clear, I think, to everybody who really knows that area. This is one area that things. Now, of course, that doesn't justify Putin's invasion. This surprised me. Mm-hmm. To me, it does tell me that he's beginning to lose the rationality he did have before. Mm-hmm. That is dangerous. And I think we were right to make sure that Russia doesn't totally extinguish Ukraine sovereignty. On the other hand, to say that, well, Ukraine should be able to decide what it does. I'll ask you, Mexico is a sovereign country. Does Mexico have the right to make a military alliance with China or Russia, or for that matter, with anybody else against the United States? Of course not. We would do anything to prevent that. And why we can't understand that. And yes, absolutely, the attack on Ukraine was a war crime. So was George W. Bush's attack on Iraq, an absolute war crime. How much of our media pointed that out?
Not much.
I read about shock and awe, not about what was happening on the ground in Iraq. And at the time, Iraq was no threat to us. It wasn't even close to us. We have not set a good example. And we're in a bind now that nobody is going to win.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your eloquent statement. I want to go to the audience, but first I want to ask Svetlana and Tom. I know there will be questions for you, but a few words after Ambassador Matlock, or?
It's really hard to follow Ambassador Matlock, except to say that I completely agree with you. I would only add, I see many more differences between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the situation today. So other than lessons, I wouldn't draw direct parallels. But I would say when we talk about Putin, we should not equate him with Russia. Mm-hmm. Russia is much more than Putin. Russia has real diversity of people and opinions. A lot of them are suppressed now. Russia also has a history where change comes unexpectedly, very rapidly. And of course, your president, Ronald Reagan, had to deal with that experience. He suddenly got a new general secretary who was willing to negotiate. And we should all be prepared. If such thing happens, we should be prepared. But if we keep equating Russia with Putin, we will never be prepared to enter a new stage of relations with Russia.
Thank you. Tom?
I just had two thoughts of direct parallels. Jack Matlock said he didn't predict the invasion because it clearly was not in Putin's interest to invade Ukraine. It's just done enormous damage. It's consolidated Ukraine. It's pariah state of Russia, et cetera. It reminded me, the CIA on September 19th, 1962, told John F. Kennedy there's no way this guy Khrushchev would ever put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Ever. Not ever. You know why? Because it would be terrible for him. It'd be really bad for him. It would get us all upset. It could lead to a real crisis. So there's no way he would ever do that. That was September 19th. The Poltava had just arrived with 8 more medium-range missiles were unloading in Mariel Port. And a couple of years later, the author of that estimate, Sherman Kent, published in an internal classified magazine, classified for 30 years until we got it through the Freedom of Information Act. He said, you know, that estimate, everybody rags on us about that estimate, but we were right and Khrushchev was wrong.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Svetlana for those words. I've always felt that if you don't study, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church, you're not studying Russia today. But one last thing about Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, who passed away about a month ago. Gorbachev, he was the most committed arms reductionist, abolitionist to ever hold power in a nuclear country. And his vision, Svetlana knew his brain trust well. There was a man named Chernyayev.
Anatoly Chernyayev.
That's another conversation, but I'd be most interested how the Cuban Missile Crisis affected Chernyayev, Gorbachev, Shakhnazarov. But I'm going to turn to questions, and I want to begin with Lyle.